Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be listening to 801 Live by 801.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
Now, you'll have to excuse me because in this review I'll try to explain to you the premise of this band and this live album, but all in all I found it kind of difficult to actually phrase it in words, so please do pay some respect to the fact that I'm even trying, and let me of course get into this firstly with some of my favorite bits from this album.
Like at Christmas, haha, isn't like the circus round in circles like the archers, always stiff or always starchy. Yes, it's happening and it's fattening and it's all that we can get into the show.
So 801 Live is a, well, you guessed it, a live album by an assortment of people that you might call a band that go by the name of 801. And this band formed from the hand-picked group of musicians that were chosen, of course, by Phil Manzanera, that you might know from Roxy Music. Now, this is where I find it difficult to kind of describe the activity and the members of this band, so just stick with me. So besides Manzanera, the other very noticeable artist on here is of course Brian Eno, who made a lot of music by this point by himself in his solo works, and he's also worked with Manzanera in the past as well as many other artists. We can also find in this band Lloyd Watson from Roxy Music, Francis Monkman from Curved Air, Bill McCormick that you might know from Matching Mole, and we also have Simon Phillips, who is a very well-known session drummer that worked with so many artists that I honestly can't even count. Of course, all of these guys were involved in various other prog acts throughout their lives and maybe other stuff, but these are just the standout ones. And together these guys would set out to basically perform music taken from Phil Manzanera's discography, Brian Eno's discography, and even from bands like Quiet Sun or Diamond Head, and even more surprisingly from the Beatles and even the Kinks. And while there is a bit of original material created by the band for their live shows, most of the songs they would perform are honestly just kind of covers and tributes to other bands in themselves, and the main premise of this wasn't really to be a cover band or a tribute band, it was just to perform really good music all together, creating this very interesting live compilation, and in its essence giving their audience the night of their lives. And in one of those faithful nights on September 3rd, 1976 in the Queen Elizabeth Hall, yeah, I know the irony, these guys would rock out a performance like no other that came before it, and luckily this performance was recorded entirely and it was compiled and put into one album, which is the album we're reviewing today, called 801 Live. Now, I'm just putting this one out there, 801 would actually go on to release a full-on original album in 1977 comprised of their own uniquely written tracks, and while that album might be fine in its essence, it's definitely not what this band is going to be remembered for, especially in the future to come. So, like any great performance, this one opens up with a very short but very ground-setting introduction, and that's a track called Lagrima, which is basically just Brian Eno on the distorted keyboards getting everyone into the mood of things. And this one is immediately followed up by a track called TNK, which stands for Tomorrow Never Knows. Now, if that title sounds familiar to you, that's because it actually comes from the song Tomorrow Never Knows from the Beatles album Revolver. And yes, this is a cover song for the Beatles. And I just love how funky and groovy this track is, and they took this cover and made it something unique of its own, basically creating a whole new experience of listening to this already well-known track. But if there's a track that I honestly think is the best from this album, it has to be the one that comes after it, and that's East of Asteroid, which is a lovely track which is very jazz influenced as well, and it's just a beautiful instrumental which is all led by Glenn McCormick's bass, which honestly was the selling point for this one with me. But the interesting thing about this one, I see a lot of people naming so many versatile tracks from this one as being their favorite, and it's honestly really hard to find one track that is overall agreed by all to be the best. Now, before I go on to talk about the rest of the tracks on this album, I feel like I have to take a break and talk about something equally important, and that's the progressive aspects of this album. You see, while all of the members playing on here are prog players or prog related players, and they have some strong relations to the prog world, I really couldn't call this one as actual progressive rock. I think that a better description for this one would be a prog related live compilation. And while I don't basically believe that any of the tracks on here are downright progressive, I still do believe that the sound of this entire album really harkens to what every single prog lover loves. Now, saying every single one isn't really that correct, but I do find a lot of people that like prog probably would like this one as well, despite it technically not being progressive. Everything from the composition to the actual energies of the show, the way that the instruments are being played, and the players themselves just screams prog rock. And even if it isn't really that on paper, I really can't help the fact that it's just a perfect album for any prog lover. Now let's move on with this fairly quickly. I'll point out my standout moments from individual tracks. So Wrong Wrong comes to us from the Canterbury scene with the only album from Quiet Sun, which is called Mainstream, and honestly I do think that it's very nice and definitely gave me a sense of what Quiet Sound sounds like. Somber Reptiles is one of those Brian Eno tracks that honestly is the last glimpse of his good old prog days before he went full on ambient. Diamond Head and Miss Shapiro both come from the same self-titled album from the band Diamond Head. I am honestly surprised how I didn't know about these guys. It's basically a mix of Brian Eno and Phil Manzanera doing stuff together, and I can't just simply understand how no one has ever talked about this album, because from the two glimpses I got from it, it sounds absolutely marvelous. And then we get what is probably my least favorite track from this entire album, which is called You Really Got Me, which is of course a cover for the King's song of the same name. This one isn't entirely bad, I just don't feel like it really diverges a lot from the original. It kind of feels like a lazy cover of the original, not making anything new out of it, and honestly I really didn't expect this from these guys, so I'm a bit let down with this one, but don't let it fool you, it didn't really falter with my overall experience of this wonderful album. And one of the best tracks from this album has to be the last one, called The Third Uncle. This one is a beautiful one, and one of the things that I actually kind of liked about it had to be the Brian Eno vocals. Despite his very limited vocal range, it just has this sort of beauty to it that I really can't think of any good way to recreate. Honestly, Brian Eno's song on here kind of reminds me of Depeche Mode's Dave Gahan, and also of the Talking Heads' David Byrne. Now, speaking of Talking Heads, I do believe that you can make some comparisons between this band 801 and Talking Heads. Now, it's not what you think. I do believe that the main comparison is actually moving on from prog into the new age. Of course, the Talking Heads was never a prog band, but they were definitely one of the pioneers of the new age sound. sound. You see, as I said earlier, these guys weren't strictly progressive, yet they do harken very well to prog lovers, and I think that one of the reasons for it is because they are moving forward. All of these guys know that prog will probably not last forever, and they wanted to reinvent the sound of this genre, and thus they created their own music, which actually went ahead and got closer and closer to what we now call new wave. And this metamorphosis probably came at the right time. In 1976, people were probably loving this type of sound, and honestly, I can see how a show like this in a packed room of audience would be received so well. So yeah, this is a fantastic album, and now on a personal note to all of my friends who have kept talking about this album so many times before I started doing this series, thank you so much, because you've inspired me to actually give it a listen and enjoy it for as much as I did. And while no individual person actually recommended this one to go on the list, I do believe that this decision to put it on here was a very right one, and as I said, I am just so glad I did. I love this cover. Again, yada, 2 colors, main colors, oh, it looks so good, yeah, but it's not really the case on here. I just feel like this cover really manages to capture the essence of what this album feels like. It is interesting that they chose a bass to represent the cover for this album, despite the fact that the 2 leading members on here are actually a guitarist and a keyboardist, but I guess that aesthetically this is what looked best, and honestly I couldn't even think of this cover looking any better with a guitar neck, or of course anything other than that, like a drum set or keyboards or whatever. And if you're interested, you can do a Google search for this one, and you can see that there are many variations of this one cover, all of them keeping the same idea in its essence with the bass and the colors, but everyone changes things up with where the text is portrayed and how many ticks there is. But honestly, when the essence of it is preserved, this cover looks very much good in all of its variations. With no ifs and or buts, this album gets a solid 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to May by Ekelin. Yes, we are revisiting Ekelin once again. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Wan, Aristov Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.